I'm a parent. My kids are grown. They're wonderful people, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. And as a Christian parent, my greatest hope and prayer was that all my children would grow up to follow Jesus. But that hasn't happened. I know that their story's not over yet, but so far not all of my children would consider themselves Christians. And yet, God promises that if we raise our kids right, that they're going to turn out right, right? So what happened to that promise? Isn't that what Proverbs teaches in Proverbs 22, verse 6, where it says, "Direct your children onto the right path, and when they're older, they'll not leave it." It seems to be saying that if I teach my children to love and honor God and to live for Him and put Him first, that when they grow up, that's how they're going to live. They won't leave that path. It's like if I provide careful and consistent training, I can guarantee my kids eternal destiny and guarantee them a blessed life. And based on this verse, a lot of Christian parents wonder what they did wrong because their children grew up and they aren't following Jesus. What happened to God's promise? God let them down. But God keeps His promises, so it must be my fault. I didn't work hard enough, or I didn't do it right. But here's the problem. Proverbs 22 is not a promise of God. In fact, it's a good example of one of the many passages in the Bible that well-meaning people claim as promises, but aren't promises at all. This is where a sound interpretation of the Bible comes into play. We have to understand that there are different types of literature in the Bible and that proverbs are not the same as promises. Now, the book of Proverbs contains wise sayings and sound principles for ordering and guiding our lives. But a proverb is simply an observation about how life consistently works. And if you pay heed to that, then things are going to be better for you. But a proverb should not be taken as an absolute promise because there can be exceptions. We have proverbs in English, like haste makes waste. That's generally true. If you're hurrying, you're more likely to make a mistake and have to start over again. But it's not always invariably true. Sometimes haste works out quite well because you get the job done quicker. But likewise, the collection of proverbs in the Bible are wise principles of life that make sense to apply, but they're not ironclad promises with no exceptions. Consider just one example among many from the Proverbs. Proverbs 28 verse 19 says, "A hard worker has plenty of food, but a person who chases fantasies ends up in poverty." Well, we can all think of exceptions. We know of people who chase fantasies who end up winning the lottery, and people who work hard but still have trouble making ends meet because they're victims of injustice or just because of a general downturn in the economy. But we also recognize that generally speaking, most of the time, you're better off financially if you work hard than if you daydream. And so when it comes to raising children, it's still worth it to make every effort for your kids to follow Jesus. And Proverbs 22 verse 6 is still very hopeful because it explains how parenting usually works. And it encourages us that it's worth it to train up our kids to follow God. And it's likely that our kids will follow that path throughout their lives. But we can't control every influence in our children's lives. And plus, the Bible affirms that people have a choice. And we see this principle throughout the Proverbs as well, that the individual choices people make determine their destiny. And so you should go ahead and read and study the Proverbs and put those principles into practice in your own life and build them into your family life and teach your children. And there are other principles of wise parenting throughout the Bible. And as parents, we don't want to ignore them. We want to give our children the best framework we can from God's Word to give them every opportunity to follow Jesus. We don't want to leave that up to chance or abdicate that responsibility to somebody else. But then it's up to our kids to decide what they're going to do with that legacy. Take a minute and talk about that.